Flake and quartz floors. Who's done flake or quartz floors? Has anyone installed them? 1, 2, 3. So even though it's the most common kind of quote industrial floor or garage floor, you just see flakes. You know, they're very common. And even though it seems like they're so simple, there is stuff to it, and a lot of it's related to what we've already done. It's the prep that was demonstrated on this floor. Cutting your concrete the right way, getting your primer, and then depending on if it's quartz or chips, it's putting the proper resin down, applying your broadcast, and then cleaning it up, and then putting your top coat on. So it is really the most simple and least, I'll call it the least artistic of them, but those are the bread and butter of flooring. So we just want to make sure that people understand the process and know that, yeah, if I can do the metallic, I've seen that, I can shift to a media broadcast floor, pretty simple. Okay, Josh, just review the prep before we do a floor. And because we had some real world weirdness this week, Josh improvised, so he'll talk a little bit about what was improvised to salvage a surface, which is going to happen in real life. You're going to have situations where you can't bust out someone's garage floor and start over. You have to work with that surface that you have, make it as right as possible. The nice thing is you're covering it with the broadcast media, so you have some leeway, and you're going to see this is going to work out great.
From the concrete slab up?
Yeah, just real quick.
All right, yeah, if everybody recalls from the first day, took off the old coatings and materials that were on the floor, just like a real job, to completely clean it with a diamond grinder, scarifier, whatever's necessary to take that top coating or the contamination away from the floor. After that, we vacuumed it, then we de-dusted it with the shop blaster to get all the fine contamination, mineral dust, whatever was inside the pinholes, all of that cleaned out. As a result, when the coating was put on, maybe it was a temperature issue, material, whatever, we got air bubbles. Well, the air bubbles are basically just air that's been trapped that as the material starts to harden and cross-link and create tension, pulls the air out of the holes that we put in the floor with the shop blaster. People say they don't like the bubbles. I don't like the contamination down inside the holes that would have maybe eliminated the bubbles, but would have stayed there nonetheless. JD's not here to argue with me, so I'll say in the presence of moisture, I would worry about that mineral dust in those holes if there ever was a moisture issue down the road as far as affecting the bond line of the coating. So that brings us to the floor that I'm standing on right now, that has been run over with the machine to remove the bubbles, flatten the crowns that are around the bubbles so that doesn't telegraph through the next coating, so that when we put the next layer on, we're not going to see any of those bumps. Now, Don talked about improvisation. What we did here, what I did with the urethane, is filled in all these tiny little holes, the voids that are there from the bubbles. We removed the bubbles crown, but the void is there nonetheless. So we still have an open space in the floor that would show through, because it's obviously an elevation inequality that's going to translate or telegraph through that next coating. Quick and dirty was the urethane to just basically get everything smooth so that we can illustrate the floor without any telegraphing issues. In the real world, I would use an epoxy type product, I'd use a polyaspartic type product, I'd use something appropriate that, though it wouldn't dry as fast as urethane, it would be, from a longevity standpoint, something that is correct for the floor that's here, and also to make sure that the next layer that goes on can actually bond to it. Urethane, generally speaking, in my experience anyway, urethane, if it's not abraded, ground, before anything is put on top of it, it has such a hard skin, nothing will bond to it. So that means there's no open time, there's no open window. Epoxy has about 24-hour open window where we do not have to reabrade it unless you have bubbles, and we can get a chemical bond interlayer adhesion between the two coats. On urethane, that's not the case. We'd have to regrind this. But again, for our purposes today, we really just want to make sure that we don't have any telegraphing issues with the next layer we put on. So the improvised part that I wouldn't do in the field would be this, unless I was prepared to 100% grind it. And that also means that it would have to be so perfect that if I run the grinder over it and I see shiny spots like I do all through the floor, if I see any shiny urethane, that means my diamond's never touched it, which means my coating will not stick to it. So that's why I would strongly recommend not to use a urethane like this, unless I knew, like if I was filling a crack or a nail pop, unless I knew that when I run my grinder across it, it all changes to a monotone color, that everything matches where the diamonds have hit it. Anywhere it's shiny, it could inhibit the bond.
This layer up front is going to be just traditional a flake, okay? But before that, we're going to do what we call, doesn't really have a name, it's a Flake Quartz hybrid. And it's something that I thought of playing around in our shop when we first got this media in because, okay, and this is just personal, I don't like partial flake floors. And what I mean by partial flake, it's the stuff, you've got a shiny gray coating and you've got, it looks like confetti fell on the floor, and it just looks, to me it looks just very incomplete, ugly, industrial, that they tried to make it pretty and failed.
DIY.
Okay, very DIY. And I'm not offending anyone who does. Some people make a living off doing partial flake floors. That's great. And they can look nice, but most of the time they don't, because it's your big box store kit. Okay? But I don't always like a full flake floor because they're much better, but they're very busy. Okay? So that brings us to quartz. Quartz is a decorative sand, really fine, comes in a lot of different colors, is a very durable floor. Okay, so it's tougher than flake floors. They're not used as much. I mean, for forklift traffic, things like that, they're brutally strong. But what I don't like about just a normal quartz floor is they're a little too plain. They almost look like a super fine low pile rug to me because there's very little color variance. So when I was messing around with the shop, I'm like, what about a combination of the two? Because what I don't like about the partial flake is the stark, shiny, glossy background that's showing all the imperfections of the concrete because they never got it smooth. So it just looks tacky. So by laying quartz down as that background, it gives you a nice, classy background. Then the partial flake is accents in it, and it looks very appropriate. Okay? So I did a couple samples in the shop, brought it over to Josh. We played around with it a couple times. He's made it more famous, and he's done a great job with it. It's not very common. In fact, we don't see it anywhere, but we will soon. So the idea is, and this is where it's a little bit more precise than a flake, is we're putting down a very thin layer of our broadcast resin, which means the stuff we're going to throw it into. We're going to use a polyaspartic for speed, but typically I would just use an epoxy. But the key is you got to get it ultra thin. The reason is ultra thin because we're going to throw that flake in there first. Okay, our confetti, our real light. Then we have to come back and immediately hit with the quartz on top of that. You basically bury your confetti in this quartz. You're like, well, how's that going to work? It works very well because where your confetti is sticking down, that quartz isn't going to stick to it. It's got a piece of flake sitting there. So you pile on with quartz, when everything dries, that just blows away and it exposes all your confetti. But all the sticky resin, the glue in this part, is going to grab all that quartz. The reason it has to be very thin is because you've got your piece of confetti and here, and then your quartz kind of has to fill this area. If you do too thick with resin, what will happen is your flake will go on, which is great, but when you throw your quartz on, it's going to sink that flake down on top, and it will actually create craters. So the goal for this floor is it is a very thin application. It remains very smooth. There's a nice tactile quality to it because you get the quartz, and you get the color influence from the larger flake that's in there, and it turns out very nice. You clean it up the next day, whatever. Today it's going to be today. You vacuum it up, and then you top coat it a couple times with like a polyaspartic again, or whatever your choice of top coat is, whether it's a urethane, and you're off and running. Okay. Then we'll move on to the simple traditional flake floors and show you that. Very similar process, we might get some volunteers actually do it to see because it's very simple. All right. Am I missing anything?
If it sounds complicated to anyone, I still haven't been able to explain it so it doesn't confuse people. The best is to be here and see it. As you see the two interact. The mistakes I've made though has been not having a monotone background because we're going on with only 7 mils of material. We already measured this out. We know we're doing 45 total mils. We're going to lose a couple ounces in the roller. We need to put on about 39 total ounces over this whole area. That's how precise it has to be. Because again, if we're a little too thick, we broadcast that flake in, it's going to sink. Like Don said, the resin's going to go over the top of the flake, and then the quartz is going to stick to that, and we won't see the flake. That's probably the biggest screw up there is. And then also knowing that that layer's so thin, it's not going to mask very much of what's behind it. It's acting just as basically a very thin layer of glue.
So one of the keys that you want to do is decide on your background of your color coat. Okay. So for example, if you were doing black quartz, which is beautiful, and you're going to want to make sure your background is as dark as possible. If you decide, oh, I'm going to use white primer, what's going to happen is two things. The primer can shadow through on your original coat. So in this case, this is black. If we decide we're going to use a white primer, we'd have to have so much resin in there and make sure that this is like painted so you can't see through it. And then, as well as, because your quartz layer is so thin, any missing spots you see in your quartz, it's gonna shadow through. So again, the hardest part is getting everything as even as possible. So just know what your background color is. If you're starting with a dark, what you're gonna want to do is make sure your broadcast media is also gonna be fairly dark. That's all.
Yeah, a little bit
or
of practice.
Matches.
A little bit of practice, and you'll be able to figure out if you're doing sample boards, because it's a very attractive floor when it's done. But you can also make up sample boards with colors that are already known to work together, as far as making that base slab a monochrome or a single color, so there's no variation, and what that's going to take in material and time, and then also what quartz is going to work with that to kind of complement that. So if there is incomplete coverage, you know the quartz is coordinated enough with the base color that it's not going to translate through. I did a white base the other day. It's all gone now, but I did a white base and I had roller lines in it that weren't lines as far as profile change. It was actually, you could see the concrete below the thin layer of white because it was such a light color. You could actually see the lines of the darker concrete underneath that. That translated right through another 7 mils of white resin and through a quartz. You could actually, with light on, you could actually see those lines. Because the quartz, believe it or not, it is absorptive, and it also is in some regards translucent. You can kind of see light around it. So if you have a big change in color underneath it, that'll pop out in bright light. Those are the mistakes we've made.
In our case, because we're black background, we're not putting down white. We're going to go with our glue coat is going to be black, so we won't have those shadows. This is just going to be a jet black floor, which is perfect. The quartz I have is actually on a lighter side, but it's a white and black. So as long as we get our quartz broadcasted very evenly, we should really have no shadows coming through.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
All right, let me mix up the material. So what we're mixing up right here is the Polyaspartic 85. We're going to use that as our quote glue coat. Very thin layer, just a few mils, and it's going to hold the quartz and the flake in place. It cures out fast. You're just looking at a few hours. We'll be able to vacuum and sweep this off, and then put 2 top coat layers on this, and we could park a car on this by the end of the day.
No puddle. And again, the only reason that we're looking, I mean, it's always important to not have variation in thickness, but the reason it's so important here is because anywhere he throws the flake, if it hits and it's only so thick, if it hits that and then sinks underneath, or the quartz is going to help it to sink underneath, we're going to lose the flake altogether.
You guys want to come see how thin this is? It's really like rolling out a coat of paint.
It's like glue, really.
Yeah. Then,
Feed the chickens?
feeding the chickens.
Oh, what's the thickness of that, you say? 7 mil?
Was that 6 mils, Josh, or no?
That was 7 mils.
7, okay.
That's one thing you want to do, you want to throw it high.
Yeah, high you get a lot of spread, and it's great on a wide open space. That's the fun part of sparse flake. And guys who do this all the time, I mean, they're just, they do this whole spot in probably the time I'm doing this little bit. Yeah. And you can buy flake spreaders. I think that's goofy.
It's better with your hand.
It's higher one.
Hand in a bucket.
Yeah, they make the backpack.
Yeah, the backpack.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are nice. If you're doing big space, they are nice.
The only hard
You don't
part
want
is
to
it's
throw
if
it
you got
with the wind blowing in your face.
spot way over
No.
there, you
Like
can't
this with
reach
the
it,
wind.
you gotta ball it.
Yeah.
Last time Tony did
What's that?
threw a whole
That's
bucket
the
on the
wind.
floor.
Look out for
We
it.
had to leave it.
And it's really a matter of taste. I mean, how much you put on it.
Where's your safety glass?
He went like
How
that with
much,
the bucket.
I have glasses.
Right out of his hand and landed in the middle of the room.
This is about what you did at your
He had
mom's.
to peel the bucket.
That's probably a little heavier, but it's fine. I mean, it's good. It's up to you.
And you can do designs. If you get crazy, just think you could do like an oval, you could do a heavy flake in one spot, and then you do the rest of the stuff. So you have the ability to customize it however you want. It's black ice, so it's white, black, and a real pale blue. And then quartz. Quartz isn't clean. It's just about...
That's actual quartz.
You want to throw it up though, don't you, Don? Because you don't want to.
I don't want to get too many streaks and push it. We're so thin. Yeah, I mean, we can...
Yeah, I just did it like the flake.
Yeah.
That looks better.
Just worried.
If you go too low and you're too big of a handful, you can start pushing stuff. You just got to be careful with it.
Yeah, you don't want to mound it.
Unless you can blow your mounds around. Which you can, because we have a blower. Unless JD stole it.
Patty into the guy.
And really what you're looking for is to everything be dry.
Kind of like what you did over there.
Kind of like how Josh was doing Josh and JD, the sand broadcast before the epoxy.
To rejection.
To rejection.
Because all that'll stick is the exposed, in this case, glue, the resin.
So you can save, some people save it, and see, we're starting to not see the flake anymore. That's okay. If this was a deep floor, what would be happening is the flake would start getting pushed down too far.
It would just disappear.
What mesh size are you on that quartz there? Do you know?
No, I mean, just by feet. Oh no, this has got to be 60 plus. It's fairly fine.
But it's pretty standard, I think, for quartz, industrial quartz floors, isn't it? Or is there different sizes?
This is probably between 50 and 70. We do a lot of 40 to 70 in our mixes, and this is very similar. This is worse than watching me try.
Wherever it's fine. Don't sweat in the Polyaspartic, though. So again, not to harp on it, but the thickness of that bottom coat is when we vacuum this off, the only reason we'll be able to see that flake is because we didn't bury it with the sand in a resin layer that was so deep it could be buried. If you make that mistake, you're going to lose it. And the problem then is the expense to wait for this thing to cure enough to then somehow, if you're going to try it again, grind it at least smoothed out and then have to somehow blank it all out, mute it all out with another coat of resin. You can see that if you screw this up, it's going to be a very expensive mistake to pull off the look that was maybe sold on the job. It's a really cool floor. It's just, there's a couple mistakes that are very easy to make, but if they're avoided, we put it on social media and nobody has claimed that it wasn't his idea first. Then they would usually, everybody wants to argue, and so far, he's the only one that had this idea. And
So how are we doing for wet spots? What do you guys see? Because and usually you walk around, but...
Just all the dark spots. It's okay, it's only going to stay where it is, but the problem is, if you have that shadowing, you will see it. And you can't hide a color variation because this stuff is like translucent as the light shines on it.
So as far as coverage goes, quartz is done a couple different ways. You generate a lot about like a pound per square foot, okay? So, and that's double broadcast. So in traditional quartz, what you do is you do your base layer, you put it down, you flood it, then you come back, put another layer of the poly on top, and then do it again. That gives you 2 layers. You do about a ½ pound per square foot on average, so you don't go as heavy as this. This process, because you're trying to eliminate every single spot, you overload it, you end up doing about 1 pound per square foot on this. So the same as a double broadcast, but if you're so inclined, you can recover a lot of your quartz. because most of it's not gonna stick, you can use that. In a double broadcast, you truly are putting a 1 pound down on the floor, but this is really only gonna hold about a half a pound per square foot. That's how it's gonna work out.
I'm just gonna vacuum up this excess.
Yeah. Now we're gonna get this one ready to do the flake.